Welcome to the Concussion Fix podcast, where we lift the veil on concussion recovery and empower you with real answers to real questions about persistent concussion symptoms.
Welcome to this week's episode of Concussion Fix podcast. I'm Nikki Fraser and I am joined with Dr. Hrkal, one of the instructors in the program. And today we are going to be talking about gut health and PCS. And as Hippocrates says, all disease begins in the gut. So it's a great topic to kind of dive in for this week's episode. And to begin with, maybe you can share with us, Dr. Hrkal, why is it that gut symptoms are so overlooked when it comes to concussion care?
Yeah, sure, Nikki. Great conversation topic because I think that it is one of those low-grade, sneaky things that people do experience. So I'll tell you right off the bat, anyone that's had a concussion knows about nausea after a concussion. That's huge. And that's because of the autonomic nervous system, the visual and vestibular system, all the systems that are basically gathering input from our surroundings. They are responsible for also regulating some of the areas in the brain that control for nausea. So when those things are dysregulated, anyone that's been on a ship that's moving on a boat, anyone that's been in let's say a roller coaster and they're spinning and their eyes and their body's out of place, they get nauseous, and this is the same mechanism. And there actually is a connection between the brain and the gut, and these systems can induce things like vomiting in more severe cases and nausea. I just had a patient today where she still got nausea after getting overstimulated. So this is someone that was part of the program, also has been seeing multiple providers, and so there still is some of that nausea when symptoms really get more severe. So that's one of the signs that saying, hey, you know what, these systems are dysregulated, and that's the immediate thing. But it's the stuff that is connected between the gut and the brain via that nerve that everyone's heard of, the vagus nerve, that can influence systems and symptoms lower in the intestinal tract. So we know that there's animal model research showing that within 3 hours after sustaining concussion, there is an increase in permeability in the gut lining, not just in the blood-brain barrier, but in the gut lining. And that is part of the mechanism we theorize that is increasing the inflammation, that recruitment from the rest of the body to be able to actually resolve that concussion. And that should resolve again, like some of the other electrochemical imbalances in the brain after about 14 to 20 days. But in persistent symptom cases, that gut dysfunction continue. And that initial disruption, Nikki, can lead to having persistent symptoms like stool changes, either constipation or diarrhea, gas and bloating. And I know today we're going to talk about things like SIBO, which is a form of dysbiosis, that small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So you can even get microbiome changes. There's tons of research being poured into understanding the microbiome, and any stressful event, within minutes of that stressful event, the gut lining becomes permeable, but also there's changes to the actual microbiome. So that's a real fascinating area that researchers and scientists are looking into to try to find out if we can somehow leverage that as part of the treatment protocol.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you mentioned SIBO. So people who have never had IBS or SIBO beforehand, and then after a concussion, and then they have PCS, who are then diagnosed with IBS and SIBO. So that can be directly related then, if they've never had it before. And I'm assuming then those who've had it before and it has worsened afterwards also is pretty common then.
Yeah, so I think that's probably the thing that you mentioned just last here is that concussion is one of those triggers that exposes an underlying imbalance. So most often a person's had something like an irritable bowel, which is what IBS is, irritable bowel syndrome, and trauma of any type, and concussion absolutely fits both a physical and a electrochemical and a mental emotional trauma, and that can increase symptoms. And that is, again, exposing an underlying, we'll call it a metabolic and functional kind of a deficiency that a person has or imbalance. And so that's the most common thing by far. Less common is someone that has had zero gut issues, and then all of a sudden, after a concussion, they have a whole bunch of new gut symptoms that have come about. It is possible, and oftentimes it's this like unholy combination of, not doing any physical activity, dietary changes, not for the better, just to kind of cope, and the actual physiological changes we just talked about, the gut-brain axis, unfortunately causing a slower digestive kind of movement, more nausea. That's again causing dietary changes. And then even using things like medications. And so some people will use like pain medications that can cause more gut inflammation. And so sometimes that's where these new symptoms can come on. And people develop things like food sensitivities. People develop things like IBS symptoms, gas, bloating, stool changes. And then, people wonder, like, what can I do about it? Well, working on some of those underlying nervous system imbalance and actions, and also the mental health aspect, which we know is that stress response, is ultimately the root cause solution. So getting on acid blocking medication and popping antacids and doing all the typical things is just a total band-aid and often doesn't work. So we have to understand this as a nervous system overactivity or underactivity in some cases on the actual gut.
No, and you make great points, right? So, I mean, after PCS, after concussion, you're doing everything that you can to survive. So that is eating unhealthy, and usually first response from any kind of practitioner when you go to your doctor is going to be, here's a medication, which, like you said, is usually so hard on the gut. So I mean, it's just kind of that perfect storm to really imbalance someone, and then you just feel like garbage on top of it because your digestive system isn't working, and it just kind of all piles and piles and piles, and it's that vicious cycle until, like you said, we can work on, the nervous system and cleaning up diet and, taking out those inflammatory foods and all those things that you talk about in the nutrition part of the program and that Melinda talks about in, regulating the nervous system are so important to really, you don't think that it would help with IBS or SIBO, but they are really important because they are connected to the gut still.
There. Actually, one of the things that we're really finding out is that a lot of medications, supplements, and definitely dietary interventions, uh, we kind of think of like, well, you know what can I eat that's like brain friendly, or what can I eat that's anti-inflammatory, thinking that, that blueberry that I eat is somehow going to get in our bloodstream and then get in our brain and somehow like heal that inflammation there. That is, I would say, kind of like a very blue sky approach, like, oh, that's the ideal. However, the reality is that most of the things that we consume don't make it that far because there's a lot of absorption hurdles they have to get through. What most commonly happens is that it's working on the microbiome. So, for example, there's a great herb, a lot of research on it, called turmeric. It is well known for its anti-inflammatory effects. It's part of the ginger family. We talk about it in our Concussion Fix course as one of the best anti-inflammatories that has some pretty good animal model studies on it showing beneficial effects after a concussion. Now, what we now know is that also curcumin, as good as it is in preclinical trials, it just doesn't really have the ability to get to the brain and impact a human concussion as easily as it does in animal models because of absorption problems. But it still seems to have these beneficial effects because it positively influences the gut microbiome. So there's this like indirect anti-inflammatory effects from the foods we eat, from herbs and even supplements we're taking, and even certain medications, Nikki, can cause their positive impact by influencing the gut in a positive way. So we're not at the point where we can say, listen, this probiotic specifically, when supplemented after a concussion, can somehow reverse the detrimental changes. We're hoping to get there. We're not there. I think that would be great because then we can really have another tool, but we're
Right.
not there yet. So I think the benefits of the diet are really, I would say, almost indirect, where you're actually feeding yourself with a lot of beneficial macronutrients and definitely a lot of micronutrients that have antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects. But most likely, that's just correcting the imbalances that are in the gut that is then being transferred up to the brain. Because we know from the gut brain research that 80% of the communication is from the gut to the brain, not the other way around. That only 20% is top down. So that should give us kind of pause to be like, this is actually a huge area we can leverage some of those therapeutic actions without actually necessarily having to like directly infuse it into the cerebral spinal fluid or right into the cerebral vasculature. So real fascinating stuff when it comes to some of this research. And I think the gut really is the key linchpin between the therapeutic effects of diet and post-concussion symptoms recovery.
I love that. So many little tidbits of knowledge there. And we often hear that, the gut is the second brain and all that type of stuff. And so, like you said, we can't necessarily get everything to the brain just the way our body absorbs everything. And that's where focusing on the gut as the second brain, nutrition as let food be thy medicine. There's so many of those little sayings that are so relevant when it comes to our gut microbiome and helping it. And now I know recently you did a seminar and you talked about the 4R protocol. Can you share a little bit about what these 4Rs are and how does that all look when working with someone with PCS?
Yeah. So 4R protocol stands for remove, replace, reinoculate, and kind of repair and rebalance, the last one. Now, there's a bunch of permutations of this protocol. Well, basically, this is what naturopathic doctors and functional medicine doctors use as kind of like a blueprint for treating an imbalance in the microbiome. So just to set the stage, I mentioned right at the beginning of our conversation about a condition called SIBO, SIBO. That stands for small intestinal microbial overgrowth and or bacterial overgrowth. And I say microbial because it actually could be fungal as well. And so this is an example of too much of something that shouldn't be there. We are most familiar with this where somebody eats like a bad piece of food and they get food poisoning. We call that gastroenteritis. And that actually can change the microbiome temporarily because you are introducing this bad bacteria into the gut. Now, this is similar to that in the sense that, it's a bad bacteria, but these are bacteria that are just in the wrong place. So it's not so much that it's a foreign bacteria that's pathogenic, it's just a bacteria that's kind of crept up from the colon into the small intestine. Now, this is one example, Nikki, of what's more kind of generally called dysbiosis, which is the opposite of a balanced microbiome, which is eubiosis. This is like your gut, happy, no gas, no bloating. We should be going to the bathroom every single day, should be nicely formed stools, we should have no reflux. That is the ideal state of health. But when you're that balance, which is really regulated by the bacteria you have in your gut, when that balance is disrupted and now there's an imbalance or overgrowth of certain bacteria, you can get these dysbiosis conditions. And the 4R protocol basically says, first of all, you have to remove the bad bacteria. So there's certain herbs and antibiotics that are helpful to remove that. I prefer certain herbs because antibiotics, while they can be quite effective, one, let's say, called rifaximin, that's a very common one used in SIBO cases, often has a lot of recurrence, meaning that they kind of kill the bad guys, but they don't really address the root cause. The second R is replace, so that's where we have to replace some of the things that keep the bacteria away from the areas they shouldn't be, in the small intestine. They should be in the large intestine. So that's where we need digestive support, like digestive enzymes, herbal bitters, apple cider vinegar, lipase, protease. This basically keeps the integrity of the first layer of defense in our stomach, and our pancreatic juices and bile salts. These are things that keep things in check. And then that's when you finally look at reinoculation, which means put the good guys back in, prebiotics and probiotics. So a lot of people make the mistake by saying, you know what, I'm just going to jump right into the probiotics, and they actually may feel worse if you have this dysbiosis condition going on. And probiotics can be very helpful for a lot of people, but there's people that don't actually feel good, and that could be a sign you have this dysbiosis. And then the last one, if necessary, you can go ahead and starting to heal the lining of the gut. Normally the bacteria, and when they're happy and balanced, take care of that because they produce a lot of good things like short-chain fatty acids, but things like glutamine, things like aloe vera, things like kind of like demulcent herbs like marshmallow can be really helpful. Even essential fatty acids like omega-3s, which we talk a lot about in this program as brain beneficial, one of the mechanisms they have is helping the gut do its job better. So that's kind of an overview of the 4R treatment protocol. But I just want to lastly say, don't worry about memorizing what I just said. Think about working with a healthcare provider that actually is going to help walk you through this, because before you even go into that 4R protocol, you should be doing some evaluation and testing, and definitely need to be under the supervision of somebody that knows how to navigate this. And sometimes it's not as simple as just going through the 4Rs. You need to test, you need to remove, you might have to retest or change your protocol depending on how things go for you.
Yeah. And so you mentioned antibiotics with the first R to help remove that. But you mentioned that you typically like to work with different herbs. What kind of herbs would you typically work with for some people?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a whole range of them. I'll just mention ones that people are kind of maybe more familiar with. Probably one of the most well-known is a herb called berberine. It's actually an extract from a herb. Berberine's being kind of touted around as kind of a natural blood sugar balancer, because that is a lot of research on what research has been done on it. There's an essential oil of oregano. So oil of oregano is a really common one that's used in like respiratory tract infections, because it can actually have an antiviral, antimicrobial effect, but that also has an impact on the gut. Maybe probably one of the more well-known ones that have kind of an antiviral effect would be something like something like echinacea. So echinacea does have an immune supportive effect. And then if there's parasites involved, which everyone thinks nowadays they have, in my experience, you need to test for those, because I don't think it hasn't been my experience that everybody has parasites. I know there's been influencers that have said that. I just don't see it. I just don't see it in a evidence-based, reproducibly validated testing way. If you do some other testing like, dark field microscopy or some of these more fringe type tests, you might pick up tons of parasites based on that. I just don't see it in my practice when I do validated stool testing. But once we identify the bacteria or the fungus that is elevated, we go ahead and then personalize that type of treatment to that person. So no one person gets the exact same protocol, Nikki.
And that's why it's so important to work with a practitioner who's aware of all of these things. And like you said, some people, they just go right to probiotics, prebiotics, because that's, the fun words that are thrown around all the time, and you can find them over the counter. They're easy accessible, and they go and take them. And like you said, either they feel worse or they don't notice any difference sometimes. And they're like, well, why is this? Everyone is tooting the horn of probiotics and how amazing they are. But like you said, there's a certain way, certain protocols that you might have to do before jumping to those to get the effect that you're actually looking for.
100%. Yeah, this is one of those situations that it's really good to be aware of. The gut plays a role in concussion. It can be disrupted. Not everybody automatically has a ton of gut dysfunction, so that's important to point out. If you're one of those people that has had gut dysfunction, like think about it as like, my gut's never been right since I've had a concussion, or maybe even like months later, I start developing some gut issues that might make me suspect that's a problem. Or I've had underlying issues and it's been aggravated. And if they are present and you've tried some of the basics, like changing your diet, and maybe you've tried something like prebiotics and probiotics, and they haven't really made a positive difference, that's when you really want to seek out that personalized care. So honestly, it's worth investing and doing that, because it saves you so much time on trial and erroring things you're buying online, reading 1,000 different blogs, putting them into ChatGPT to figure out what it might be, and then ultimately you have to use evidence, which is testing, and you need to work with a provider to offer that testing and who offers that testing and is able to manage you through that. So not everyone has to use that, but I think if you have or strongly suspect dysbiosis, you probably should work with somebody that knows what they're doing.
Absolutely. And so, how would you handle skepticism about gut health for people who might have that mind frame of, I have a stomach of steel, nothing matters, or, everything just goes right through, but it's like, oh, well, it can't be that. Like they just have that skepticism of like, no matter what I'm going to do, it's not going to change. So how would you handle some of those comments?
Yeah. You know what? The first thing I would say about that is I would explain some of the research and the connection with some of the post-concussion issues. Anybody that's gone through the Concussion Fix program knows that it's not like absolutely foundationally fixed on your gut is the root cause. No, that's not. There's many other things. And so I think the gut is one of the possibilities, because when you start understanding things like inflammation and when you start understanding the physiology of concussion, we know that there's a number of possibilities that can lead to the underlying issue that is maintaining your symptoms, that is keeping you symptomatic. Diet and gut go hand in hand, and we explain that in a lot of detail in the Concussion Fix. And if you have symptoms that fall into those categories that are inflammatory in nature, or you've noticed just by reflecting, you know what, my gut hasn't been the greatest since I've sustained this particular issue, or it may have been, I got a concussion, my gut was fine, and then I tried a new medication and my gut was totally off since then, or I got a cold or gastroenteritis, a viral infection, then my gut was off. You start really just objectively considering the timeline, and a lot of people come around being like, okay, you know what, maybe it's a possibility. So I just want to put things into perspective first, being like, we're not going around, even though I'm a naturopathic doctor, saying that every single concussion has gut problems. No, that is the initial thing that happens, and then that resolves, just like all the other neurochemistry. But that's not what's keeping you symptomatic in persistent symptoms. That might be something that we could explore with immediate after sustaining concussion. We know there's permeability. If we could intervene on reducing the gut-related inflammation within the first 72 hours, wow, that would be something that would be very beneficial. Yeah. But now we're talking, for most people listening to this, now we're talking about persistent symptoms, and now it's very personalized. So if you have gut symptoms, or you have inflammatory symptoms, or you haven't really tried adjusting or changing your diet at all, this might be something for you to consider, because the physiology absolutely backs up that the gut can play a role in resolving your symptoms in many different ways, and a concussion can disrupt your gut.
Yeah, and some people don't realize the benefits of what they're doing as they're changing their diet, as they're introducing different supplements until they stop doing it. There's so many times that I hear like, "Oh, I don't think there's that big of a difference." And then they start reintroducing these if it's gluten, if it's dairy, if it's eggs, people who've done different things, maybe thinking what it was. And those aren't even all the things, like we don't say you have to stop eggs, but just if you stop something and then start reintroducing it, and then they all of a sudden they're like, oh, my brain fog's coming back, or I'm feeling more sluggish. And it's like, oh, so maybe there was that positive effect that you didn't realize when you were in the middle of changing your diet. So that's why I always tell people, try it for those 6 weeks. And then as you reintroduce, see how you feel, but really take note. How do you feel before you start reintroducing those foods?
Absolutely. Yeah, you're totally right. You can't really knock it until you try it. And the Concussion Fix program, because we look at things from a very foundational way, it looks at some of these possible underlying issues and has to check that box. Mm-hmm. So at least, for the skeptics, to just kind of bring it full circle to your question, I think we have to be, anyone that's exploring and trying to figure out, persistent issues that they're still experiencing, eventually gets to the point where they're like, you know what, I really need to be open-minded enough to consider all the possibilities And I need to be reflective and do some proper investigation and assessment to see if this could be an issue. Because so many times people come to us in my private practice and in the program, they say, you know what, I've done all the things. And I heard that you guys are doing something unique. I've heard you've helped somebody that nobody could help before. All right, I'm all ears. And then finally they come around. So unfortunately, that's the long route. The short route is, okay, we're presenting the research. It's possible. You know what? It might be something for you to consider if you have symptoms around that area.
Yeah, keep an open mind. And it's, 6 weeks. Just try, and 100% though, at 6 weeks at least for the
Yeah, you're
diet
talking about
part.
the
You
diet
can't,
now. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
just for
Yes.
diet itself, not the supplements or anything like that, or like SIBO or IBS or any of the other gut issues, but the diet part itself, which does have a huge impact on the gut, that's something that it isn't necessarily easy depending on what your diet was beforehand. It might take a little bit of some time to change diet patterns. But it's worth trying. And even when you are taking either supplements or changing the diet, really making sure you're doing it 100%. Because if you have little cheat snack, like that just kind of re-puts you back, not 100%, but you're reintroducing something that's throwing your gut back off. So it is just being that consistent, at least for the diet part, for those, 6 weeks is going to really allow you to see, is this something that was causing some of my symptoms or not?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. You're totally correct. Yeah, so I think that's a good way for us to think about it, and sometimes the diet makes the difference when you discontinue it. You won't really know the difference, but yeah.
Yeah. So what's one thing you wish every PCS patient knew about gut health from day one?
I think we can kind of answer that. I would say that it's possible that it's disrupted. To keep in mind that this is an area where a lot of important anti-inflammatory effects are possible, and there can be local impacts. There could be indirect therapeutic impacts by positively impacting the gut. So I would just say the main takeaway is pay attention to your gut and then treat it kindly. And the best way to treat it kindly is to feed it well and to avoid things that are disrupted. The biggest disruptors of gut function is going to be eating ultra processed foods. So these are what we would consider junk foods. So high fructose corn syrup. So those are things like pops, sugars, candies. They feed bacteria and they feed certain funguses in the gut preferentially. And so you're going to have gas and bloating and disruption just based on that. So a lot of times people eliminate those and their gut starts feeling better almost immediately. I would also say alcohol is a huge one. Alcohol is neurotoxic with the breakdown products. Again, the person that's non-concussed, maybe they can handle a drink or two. Everyone can't handle 10 drinks because that's, inebriation. And that the reason you're inebriated is because it's messing up your neurological system, the alcohol byproducts are. And so I think that eliminating those two things are really, really huge. And then we talk about eating more kind of colorful fruits and vegetables that are rich in fiber. So we keep coming back to fiber. You don't have to take a fiber supplement like Metamucil right off the bat. I think, that's what everyone's heard of before. So that's why I mention it. I think that getting it through your diet is ideal, and ultimately eating more plants is a good start. Maybe if you haven't done that before, you slowly need to implement that. You can't jump to that right away. So yeah, I think that's probably the three main things I'd be thinking about from a dietary perspective.
Awesome. Any parting words before we sign off for this week?
Yeah, I know. It was a good conversation. Hopefully people understand how important the gut is and its role in the resolution of concussion symptoms and its possible role in maintaining them. I will just make sure people clarify, like, it's not that we're saying your gut is the cause of your concussion symptoms necessarily, but it also could be a little window of therapeutic potential. So that's where, again, with dietary changes, some people, maybe a third of people that change their diet have incredible results. Their brain fog goes away. These are people that definitely have some sort of sensitivity, and they're, I would call, very, very positive hyper responders. The majority of people, I would say, are somewhere in the middle where they're like, you know what, I just generally feel better after kind of cleaning up my diet, my gut's improved. Those are the people that I think could continue to benefit being on the diet. And then there's people that just don't have an impact, but it's worth trying to see if you're one of those responders. So the gut holds some really great therapeutic potential, Nikki. And you know what? As part of the program, with inflammation being such a big ongoing factor, not just in PCS, but any chronic health issue, the inflammation and gut are very tightly connected. And so that's why we find it a really, really key therapeutic endpoint, talking about the connection between our thoughts, our brain, and the gut via the vagus nerve, and also the gut microbiome itself. Absolute fascinating area of research. I think there's a lot of things coming out, and hopefully people understand it a little more after listening to what we just talked about.
Awesome. What a great discussion. Thank you to everyone who has listened to this week's Concussion Fix podcast. And remember, recovery is possible. You're not alone. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Concussion Fix podcast. We hope you found today's episode helpful and that it gave you a little more clarity, hope, and confidence on your road to recovery. Remember, every step you take matters, no matter how small it may seem. If you feel that you could use a little more support on your healing journey, check out the Concussion Fix program. Just visit concussiondoc.io or simply type Concussion Fix into Google and read some of the reviews from people who've already walked this path. With over 3,000 success stories and an average symptom reduction of nearly 50% in just the first few weeks, it might just be the help you need to break through. Thank you again for listening. If you found value in this episode, please share it with someone you think could benefit. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a session. Until next time, stay hopeful, stay curious, and continuously remind yourself that recovery is possible.